faded out all nice. I wasn't even prepared for the end. I was just reading all the comments and listening in, and there we go. But today we are doing a Digitizing 911. We have Justin Armenta from JA Digitizing Studios. I'm Jeff Fuller from Fuller Embroidery Works. And Justin, go ahead and tell us about this, a little bit about this submission, because I believe you were the one who tracked it down.
Yeah, actually, it was a post in the group that someone was having problems with a relatively simple looking design, and they were just having some issues sewing. So I touched base with them just to see if they want to possibly have us take a look at it and review it for them so we could help them out.
Awesome. So I took a look at the file, but before we get too far, let's go ahead and go through the comments. We have Barb watching from North Central Minnesota. Hello. We have Jesse from Cyclone, West Virginia. We have TMG Custom Designs from Florida. We have Jason. I'm going to say that, and it's probably wrong, but I'm going to call it Jason. Watching from New Zealand. We have, again, Jesse, hello. And we have Mr. Frank Dunn. Good morning, all, over in the UK. So I'll go ahead and start talking a little bit about this file. I pulled it up and I looked at it in my software, and looking at the file, nothing really stood out to me there's some wrong choices in it, in as far as underlays, and especially in the garment choice that they were using. But one of the things that really stuck out to me in the picture, and I'll actually show the picture here. Let me pull that up here. So here in the picture, you see, like, we have 3 threads about right here, and then we have a gap, and then we have about 3 or 4 threads, and then a gap, and a few more threads, and then another gap. And that can be caused by, let's say, if this was a really heavy weave, which I'd say it's about a medium weave. I don't know about you, Justin.
Yeah.
But some of those gaps, especially if you start looking down, like right around here, you have nice tight stitching, and then all of a sudden you have a big gap and nice tight stitching. And it almost, and again, here you have some gaps in there, and it almost looks like part of the rotary hook the rotary hook's not catching the thread on every single stitch.
Right.
Because there are a lot of gaps here that I mean, other than looking at it and saying this is really the wrong density, that would be where I would go second. So if the density is appropriate in the file, then I would start looking at, okay, well, maybe this might be machine. And some of the gapping in there makes me think machine. And I don't know, I'm sure you have the file up too, Justin. So
yeah. So when I very first saw that, my brain is to say, if someone's posting saying what is wrong with this design, I give the benefit of the doubt that they were running something else and it was fine, and then they got to this design and they're having issues. Looking at the file and seeing that, because there can be times where not just a single setting, say like if this individual did digitize it themselves or had us digitize it, and they may not have used the right density. Yeah, it could cause this, and the sporadic gaps could be caused by the weave of the shirt. But opening the file, other than seeing a few things that could be changed, it wasn't ridiculously bad. I have seen it where if this is a DST file that was saved several times by different softwares, by different digitizers, embroiderers, and whatnot, and this, falls in this person's hands, 10 people down the line, there could definitely be some weird stuff where, even depending on where start and stop points were originally done, it'll actually turn it into small little segments. One density may be way too less when the next density is fine, so it kind of makes that choppy look too. But like I said, now that we reviewed the design a few minutes before we started, there might be some issues on the machine, and that's something that we'll definitely let him know and see if he is having problems with other designs other than this.
Yep, and that could be just checking your timing, because timing can throw that off, and then also the gap between your rotary hook and the back of the needle is another thing that you'll want to look at. But let's go ahead. I've got the file up, and
I was going to say, with the changes that we do for this individual and send him the file, it's a pretty straightforward design. This isn't, kind of weird things are open to interpretation that what may or may not work. But once we make the changes and send it over to him, I'm going to see if he's still having problems, then he may want to look at a maintenance issue.
Yep. So looking at the picture and then looking at the file. So these were the things that I did when I initially pulled it up, because I want to look, and the number one thing that you're going to see is maybe a recommendation is people are going to say, well, you need to increase your density because you've got open gaps. That's generally what you're going to hear first. So the very first thing I did when I came in here is I actually measured the density, which is going to be from point to point on a satin stitch. And we're looking at a 0.28 millimeter density right here. We come up here, it's a little more open at like a 0.48. It does come a little bit wider here at 0.5. It almost looks like that's because of the way that the satin is turning. But let's measure 0.27, 0.35, 0.37. If we come out here on the outside edge, it's going to be a little bit more, right around 0.4, about 0.4, 0.45, coming across each of the points. So that was the first thing that I did, was I started measuring those. And then I looked at the underlay, and I measured across here. So we're about 4 millimeters wide in underlay, or not underlay, but about a 4 millimeter wide satin stitch. And it looks like we have about 3 passes of a center run underlay.
Right.
Which you're on a really high pile garment. And so you're going to need some support further out away from your stitches. And then finally, the last piece that I looked at specifically on this, because you can see a little bit of the of the text in the picture, but mostly you can see these. And so the last thing that I noticed is these really terminate off to a point. And we're looking at, that's a 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeter. So I would actually exaggerate this shape out a little bit and then let the stitches pull in,
right,
to make that point, rather than digitize a point like that, because you're probably going to get some cuts in your fabric. It's going to tear a hole because you've got way too many short stitches, and it might cause you an issue on your machine.
Right.
But those were the initial things that I looked at, and I started measuring to see, what I would change and what that process might look like. And so that was my take on it. Justin, what was yours?
I mean, pretty much hit the nail on the head with everything that you said. Another thing too, given that the sample that he posted is a dark with white thread, if that is the case that you are running the design, you're definitely going to want, typically you want to use a little bit extra density and or underlay when running white thread on a dark garment. But yeah, it's just a matter of tweaking underlays, densities, maybe some pathing issues. Other than that, I really don't see a major issue. Like I said, I'd be curious to see if he runs the sample that we help him on, if he's having the same problems.
Yeah. So I pulled this in. When I pull things into Wilcom, I pull it in as stitches. So this was a DST that was sent in. It's a machine file. And when I open machine files, I always bring them in as raw stitch objects, because like Justin said earlier, there are some weird things that your software can do where it breaks it up into little segments that can cause some issues if you're not careful. And so for me, I would be redigitizing this from scratch. But Justin, I believe you bring it in as objects and you make changes to those objects.
Yeah. Typically, because there's not that very often where I do just editing on a file. If it is, it's something really quick that I would like to have it as an object, because it's just a matter of changing densities and maybe a few points here and there. But if something's coming back to me and it's generally because someone's like very, very unhappy about it, I just assume do it from scratch, just so I don't, miss anything that I may have not, seen reviewing it. and just reassuring myself the product I'm going to get back to that customer is going to be something I know is going to work, instead of just trying to tweak something else, another file that they're having problems with. But yeah, I do bring it in as objects typically.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and make some changes here to this file. I'm looking at these points. It's all symmetrical, but the software plotted the stitches a little differently on all of them. So I'm just kind of looking to pick the one that I like the best. And for me, it's this one with how this object starts here. So I'm going to come, that's pretty much a straight line, I think. And that's a curved line. So give it, that should be okay of a curve. And I'm going to come out here and we'll probably go to like right about there. And we'll see. And you can see already that it's throwing in a lot more underlay. And that's because of the settings that I have in there. What I'm really paying attention to right now is I want to make sure that because I'm copying this file, I want to make sure that my stitch objects are all going to follow the line. And you'll notice that I drew on top, and then I have my stitches are actually thrown a little bit wider, and that's because of the pull compensation I have. So the pull compensation is going to throw the stitches wider than whatever object I'm drawing. And this, I believe, I want to say I have it set at a 0.17 pull comp, which is what I do. So it's throwing each edge 0.17 a little bit further than each of those points. When I add pull compensation to things, it's generally because it's too thin of an object and I want to throw my stitches a little bit wider to catch, let's say, underlay or whatever. And then the other reason I'll start throwing pull compensation into a file is due to the thickness of the object. And this is a fairly thick pile, so it's going to pull in a little bit more. So I'm going to actually go to probably a 0.25 is about where I'm going to land to make sure that I'm throwing far enough. And Justin, you can correct me because I know you do things differently. And so if you see anything that you would do different.
No, I would just, check your density. White on a dark garment, what would you usually do a density on something like that?
So if I was doing a white on a dark garment, I would probably go with a 0.35.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, 0.34, 0.35. But like Jeff was saying earlier, if you see his point down at the bottom, he definitely plotted that a lot wider than what you're seeing those objects on screen. So again, if you see an object on screen that looks correct, that's matching the artwork, it's not going to sew correctly. So his wider point doesn't look correct on screen, but when it sews, it's going to pull in and it's going to come to that point. Another thing you want to do is make sure you pick a spot on your object, pretty much probably the top that you want to do your end point. And that way you're not throwing your lock stitches down at the bottom where you're already having those really thin stitches. And so your lock stitches aren't going to interfere with all the smaller stitches you already have in that area.
Yeah. And I mean, one other thing, depending on how wide your objects are. So sometimes I'll throw my lock stitches kind of more in the center because I want them to fall. You'll see that these will land here and I'm going to be throwing stitches on there. So the majority of the problems that you have on a machine is usually when it's starting or it's stopping. And sometimes if you're doing like little itty bitty tails, sometimes if you put your lock stitch in the middle of a satin stitch and it leaves a little itty bitty tail, it's going to cover it. And so you're not going to have to worry about it later.
Right.
And then I don't like to throw my lock stitches at a complete end. I've had people request that I do it before. I like to usually have it sew back a little bit. I don't know if I have a real reason. It's just my preference. But I will look at the stitches and the tie-offs here. So right now I should be using like a method 2 or a method 3. If you use a method 1 where it does kind of that little diamond, it can sometimes catch the thread next to it and pull it open just a little bit. And so you'll see that a little bit better. Because the best lock stitches are the ones that you don't see. They're there, but you don't see them. And now really it comes down to, as far as this object goes, it's starting to come down to they're 1.87 millimeters apart. So how much do you want your machine to trim? Really is my next thought. Because I can make it trim on every object, which is completely doable, or I can try and, closest join them together. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 points or pieces. I don't know, Justin, what do you think? You want to closest join them right here in the fat part, or trim on one of them?
I would trim on everyone personally.
That's
I
what
mean,
we'll go with then.
but his file is, and that's why I wanted you to do this, because you had that nifty little tool.
That little element that makes me go like that, and now they're all there with all of the settings that we use.
I need to get that. I always forget about that.
It's a nice one to have. And with these objects being a little bit wider, now they're about 1.5 millimeter. So if I really wanted to nail these together and try to actually put them together, I think I would go with the like 3 small stitches that I would put here, sub 1 millimeter stitches, maybe 4, to bridge that across, because it is such a kind of a higher pile garment. You could drive those stitches down in there and you wouldn't see them as much. I still think you would see them though. Maybe not as much. But let's say that takes care of the majority of this loop. So I'll go ahead and delete these objects out. And this is interesting because I have here and I have here, and they look like objects that don't actually exist. So they're almost, I wouldn't say color stops, but
like ghost stitches.
Yeah, we'll go with ghost stitches. So now looking at the text, when I initially looked at the text, the first thing that stood out to me, and I'll actually pull up his picture here, is you have these what look like really long jump stitches here. So that, looking at the file, you can kind of see this travel stitch right here, and that one right there, which I'm guessing fell on the outside of the. But looking at it as far as underlay goes, you can see we've got, I would say that this is a center run and a zigzag. This is an edge run, center run and zigzag, just a center run, and I'm not sure on this one. It's like a double center run.
Yeah, if I'm going through traveling through the stitches, and it does the bottom serif, walks up to the top part of the F, comes back down, and it actually, I think it's just a matter of some start and stop points that are inaccurate, because it does like part of that crossbar and jumps and does the vertical bar of the F, and just kind of does some jumping around in there. That's what those long stitches are.
Right, and I can tell, like, these are straight jump stitches. There's no needle penetrations in there.
Right.
So those are going to be really long, and they're going to be subject to, if the needle comes down and hits it, it's going to either push it to the outside or the inside. Those are pretty long stitches. So if we wanted to keep the original pathing, for those playing at home, I'll go ahead and we'll digitize here. We're going to come across the serif here. And again, I'm just going to kind of follow. And when I do this and I digitize to try and match something, especially if it's already in a DST, I'm going to drop my nodes at stitch points. So I'm going to come right there. And basically, I'm lining it up with the needle penetrations, knowing that it's going to throw further. And that I did wrong. Don't look at me, Justin. There we go. It's one side, then the other side.
I thought you were a column B kind of guy.
It depends on the day and what I'm working on. So we'll go ahead and do that object. And of course, I'm going to move my start and my stop points because I'm going to want to run up in the center of here. And I'll go ahead and just run. I'd actually stop here and come over.
That's what I would do.
Because then I'm not traveling unnecessarily, I guess.
Right.
And that has an interesting flare. We're just going to do a straight bar.
Yeah, I think those weird little things that you see here and there, those are just those hiccups that you're getting in those stitch files that have been saved to a DST.
And that's going to start throwing pretty wide, about 4 millimeters. So we'll come across here and about there will work. And I'm just going to bring it in. And it's tucked under here. So this one will actually tuck under. So one of the things that you can run into when you've got stitches that are going over the top of a satin like that is as this satin stitch comes, it can grab and it can cause a little separation. So there's a couple of ways to deal with that. One of them is to basically put like a bridge right here, like you would be doing 3D puff. So you just do a light satin right there, maybe throw, 3 extra stitches right here. Or one of the ways that I've seen actually Louise show is he will double back with the satin, and basically you're just throwing a few more stitches right there. Depending on the day, it's the method that I'll use. But we'll go with that method for now. And now I'm going to run up. Again, I'm going to move into the center of the object and run up here. And
if you do opt to do kind of a bridge thing where you're just throwing a couple extra stitches in there, what I typically do is when I'm making that walk from the bottom serif to my next object, I'll actually, as I'm walking, I'll go in there and just kind of do a couple extra stitches, like throw my own zigzag in there, and then
something like that.
I'm going.
Yeah.
Just so you're utilizing the same time, that you're not kind of going back and forth like you were saying, where you're traveling here and coming back here and then adding this here. Just kind of as you're walking through, be aware of anything that you need to do. That's a lot of time when I'm doing 3D puff and I'm traveling. I just say, okay, I'm traveling through an intersection. Do I need to do anything here? Do I need to add a bridge? Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? Especially with puff, because the least amount of needle penetration hitting that foam with the pressure foot hitting the foam, the better it's going to be as far as your loft of that foam.
And yep, I'm not going to disagree. I'm looking. So when I'm digitizing these objects, and this is one of the reasons why I'm actually using this tool, is as I move across, it shows me my width, my satin stitch width. So if I come right here, I'm at 1.43 millimeters wide. And I'm really watching that because I don't want to get sub 1.2. And I mean, even on this garment that we're digitizing for right now, that's getting kind of narrow. So I'm probably I'm gonna set the same pull compensation and underlays that I have over here, because the majority of the stitching is the same width. But that's something to be cognizant of, is how wide your columns are and what you're digitizing on. If this was a really tightly woven twill, I might go down to like a 0.9 millimeter wide column, and I know that I would be okay because it's such a tight material. And depending on the underlay settings that I would use, it would sew okay. But if I'm doing something really, really that has a lot of pile to it, or a really thick weave, then that's going to change those column widths.
Right. Yeah, that is one of my pet peeves with column B. I think once you get to that second side, it should kind of give you the distance. I guess the reason why it doesn't is because it's relying on you to add the angles in, so it doesn't know if you're specifically plotting points completely perpendicular to the other side. So I guess that's why it doesn't do it.
So when I use column B, I've pre-measured everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's not going to be an issue. And when I'm using column A, it's generally because I haven't pre-measured everything and I want to see where I'm going to land.
Yeah, typically what I'll do is if it's an area that I know that's going back and forth between widths, and I'm going to use column B, I'll measure the smallest width and the largest width to know if that's in between where I feel comfortable doing a satin, and then from there, anything you plot's going to be good.
Yeah. So looking at this letter, if I was actually digitizing it for me, and again, I'm following what was there already, but if I was to digitize it for me, I would have the last object be that top bar and have this tuck up underneath there. And I guess that might just be personal preference, but
I would do it. I would do it exactly like you did.
Well, then maybe I'm fired. Oh, so next up, we'll double check, and for some reason, we're doing the O and then coming back for the S. Do you think there's a reason behind that?
No.
No? Okay. Just going to make sure, because if there was a reason for it, generally if I'm making stitches, I want to start kind of center-ish, which we've already done the left portion of the logo, and then I'm going to move my way out. So this, I'm going to want to make sure I'm pushing all the material to the outside and not necessarily coming back.
Yeah, the only reason why I would say this should be broken up differently than what you are is if it's running on a hat. Of course, you're going to want to do center out. So that's something where you might do the OST first, come back, R, F, and then the flower.
But the F goes first.
I don't think it's for a hat. I think there's just something weird there going on with the file. So I would go left to right.
Yeah. And so now basically we sew the bottom, that top piece, and then we sew the bottom, and then that piece, and then the column. Okay. Just making sure that it's going to be the same. So again, we're going to come here, and I'm making sure that we're plenty wide. Come up to there, come across. I'll probably come to there. And somewhere right around here. And we'll end it right there. I should do all my pathing, Justin. Don't let me forget.
Okay. See, I would have just copied the serif from the F and moved it over.
I mean, if you want to be cool, you could do it that way.
Because I don't have cool array tools.
Well, All right, so I see I only have one tie-in. That looks good. And now we've done that. I do find it interesting, too, that the O descends a little bit further and the S seems to drop just a little bit further, too. The text is almost online. Okay. Back to where we were. I'm going to run up here. And I'll go right down the center. And I'll jump over for fun. And I'm actually going to make that just a little bit wider as I go along. Go there. I was like, my mouse isn't working. I moved it off the mouse pad. And I'm actually going to pull that back about one stitch. And then we'll throw... Hold, please. Then we come down here and go up here. And we'll follow this curve. And that is getting really thin. So I'm actually going to make it a little bit wider. And come right there. And now we'll just come down here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of times where, designs you get from customers may have a certain font that comes in really, really thin. And, of course, I always suggest that people tell people up front, hey, we may want to go to a different font if it's something that we know is going to be a real issue with the area that you have to work with or the garments you're working with. But in a case like this, this is probably a pretty thin designed serif font that these adjustments that Jeff are making to make sure that it sews properly and sews cleanly. You don't have thread breaks and you're not tearing the material and whatnot, all the different things that can go wrong. I'd say 99% of the time, the customer, the end user, whoever it may be, is looking at it's never going to notice these adjustments. They're just something that a digitizer is going to do to make sure that your design works best on your machine. So there are times where, I know the adjustment I'd have to make. Like if you're having to triple the width of a leg or an element of an art or a letter, as far as the satin width, that's something that I'd probably have to tell them up front, like, hey, just so you know, this font's going to be completely made bolder. It may look a little bit different, or just opt to, enlarge text, choose a different font or something like that.
Yeah. And you have to realize too, like the amount that I am adding to this is, I'm adding 0.5 millimeter. And if you've ever looked at 0.5 millimeter, it's like less than 1/16 of an inch. And so really what I'm adding to it is very, very negligible.
Right.
And you're likely not going to see it anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. The only time I've like you said, the extremes to go is when you're really working with thinner fonts. Those are kind of like the enemy of embroidery is really thin fonts. And I was actually helping Mike Aldoni, our friend up north, this weekend on a design. He's writing this tiny little patch, and he's looking at some sub 3 millimeter lettering. And I did a couple versions for him, to one with running stitch lettering, because that's when it's sub 3 millimeter, that's kind of where I go with. But these particular things, the way it was laying on these little filled banners, the running stitch was just coming out like blobs. So, when zooming in on the letters and doing them as satin stitches that I did with the adjustments that I did with the underlay and the density, some of the letters are unrecognizable on screen, the way I chopped them up and the way I kind of laid them out to get the shape of it. But when sewn, hopefully it's identifiable enough that you can read it. And actually turned out, given it is sub 3 millimeter lettering, it's not going to be completely legible, but it's at least recognizable to be what it's supposed to be. And a lot of times that's all that needs to be done when you are doing something that small. It's just something that has to at least resemble the image that you're trying to do.
A lot of times their eye will fill in whatever it's actually supposed to be. So they'll look at it, and it's very rare. I have seen it, but it's very rare that somebody will actually like really focus down on there and be like, wait a minute, I need this changed and this changed and this changed. You do your best, but you have to remember, and you really have to explain to your customers that this is like an artistic medium. Right. And we have physical restrictions when it comes to the size of the thread and the needles, even going down to 60 weight thread or 75 weight thread. We still have to deal with the needle and a fabric and all of that fun stuff. So, not everything is always able to be done, but we do our best to capture everything we can.
Absolutely.
And I'm sorry, Justin, but I just had to digitize this S in a different way. So I changed the order. Before it was sewing here and then running up and sewing this, and then sewing like 3 stitches here, running back and coming back. And I just opted to start here and go that way.
Right.
So if it's wrong, they can let me know and I can change it back to the way it was. But it's very difficult for me to travel that far and then travel all the way back just to run a satin stitch. So, yeah, that's how I'm going to do it for now. And now with this T, like just the crossbar. Did I change my thread color? I did, Justin. I was like, why is it coming out green? There we go.
There you
and
go.
now the T is going to be the last element here, and I'm pretty much just going to digitize it the same way that it is, because it doesn't really look like it needs to have that much change to it. We're coming up here, and we're coming, we're going to go under a little bit, and I'm actually going to step it back and just put a little bit extra thread right there. And then we'll come here, and I'll do the same thing. Actually, when I start, I'll come here and drop in there, and then come back, and it looks like it flares just a stitch here at the end. So I'm going to do it like this. I'll put that stitch there, and then I'll flare it just a little there. And now I'll come down the top here.
That back and forth at the end there, the first time I saw it used was on a file that you and I were talking about, which you had told me that Luis had showed you. I'd never seen that before. And then the other day I was editing a file, and who knows, maybe it originated from Luis, but I was going through the file and the Satin did that. I'm like, huh. It's kind of rare, a rare technique.
Yeah, and like I just saw Letty's comment come in that I forget to do that, and that's like, honestly, I forget to do it, and that's why I usually don't. I'll do something else, is because I always forget to do that. But
and it, although it's a good technique and I think it works well, I've been doing this long enough that it's like sometimes old dogs don't learn new tricks. And I just don't even think to use it in those situations.
We're going to teach that dog new tricks. We'll think about it.
Sometimes I do.
I'm going to pull that there. I'm actually going to delete that node. And I think that brings it back. This shape just looked a little wonky, and it still does a little bit right here. So I'm just going to be adjusting my nodes to make this, look a little bit more fluid.
You guys are getting into the inside of an OCD digitizer. This is what we do day in and day out.
We're like, that's just not quite right. We're going to nudge this node.
We zoom in 30-to-1 and started adjusting stitches and nodes just to make sure that everything are perfect.
That's how big it's going to sew.
Yeah.
And here we go. We got to adjust.
Hey, it just goes that it's your brain thinks of quality and you want to make sure that it's right. It's not just someone just clicking points just to get it done. It looks fine.
Yeah, there you go. Close enough. So the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to just go in and I'm going to turn off my stitches, and I'm going to take out the stitch points because that's going to drive me nuts. But what I'm doing is I'm looking here, making sure that I only have one trim per letter, which here you can see I haven't pathed it yet. And so I will set that there, and then come over here. I'll set that there and move that there. And now I'll pull that down and I'll move my tie off there. And that's, I'm looking at it, and that's, I only want it to trim on one time per letter. And I don't want to have any like large jumps inside the letters that might come outside. So
I'm going to pull up a comment. This is actually the person that we have the file from.
Okay.
He's watching. The only reason that those jump stitches were there, I think he's referring to that F that we were talking about earlier, was trying to prevent it from cutting a lot. I'm assuming that's what he meant, trimming, how to reduce the R because it didn't look good enough. Okay, so the R, maybe when he was editing the R, he took it out of the sequence. That's why it was out of sequence. So, but he's learning. He's hoping to figure out what he's doing wrong, so we can develop a better workflow, and that's what we're here for. Hopefully, we can show you a little bit of some techniques and pointers that you can use for your other designs. And like I told Rynell earlier, that us featuring it on this segment will definitely send him the file and hopefully it's something that he can utilize and work better. And Roy, now if you weren't on earlier, I think you were messaging me. I'm not sure if you heard us from the beginning. There was a few things we were concerned with as far as seeing the picture that you posted in the group and the file itself. The fact that the file on that flower part, there wasn't really evident of too much areas where we've seen these stop and start of these gaps that would cause that in the digitizing. So we were wondering if that is a problem that you are having on multiple designs, or is it just this one? If it is just this one, hopefully our corrections do help you out and it doesn't have this anymore. But if you are getting these same problems with the file we're giving you and or other files, you definitely may want to look into some maintenance on your rotary hook or something like that.
Yep, most definitely. And it never hurts to check your timing anyways. Because one bad bird nest or one needle break and your timing can get off just a little bit. So
right.
But that was one of the things that really stuck out to me is you've got some sections that are more open than others, and all of it looks like you carousel the objects and they're not quite the same. So it could be, but definitely if you're having the problem on more than one machine or more than one needle, I would design on more than one design. All my words are coming. Then I would look at maybe your rotary hook too. So I'm going to come back to this flower here because we did opt to do trims on everyone. So if we were looking at removing the trims, Justin, what's the first way you would do if you didn't want the trims in there?
If you want to jump between each element?
Yep.
So yeah, I would just make sure that, of course, the settings in Wilcom, we can go in there and turn off the trim so it doesn't trim, or put the setting that it only trims after a certain distance. But I'm going to pick a spot on there, and since these are symmetrical, it's going to be the same pretty much in all of them. Pick a spot that you are the closest to the next element. Well, there's two ways of thinking about it. If you don't want the machine to trim, and you want to trim yourself and you want to have a trim long enough that you can get your scissors in there without digging them out, then you're going to pick a spot that has a good amount of jump where you're not going to get that really long jump that it chunks your machine. But it's long enough where your scissors can easily go in there and dig out the thread to trim. If you are hoping to do the closest jump method, then you definitely want to pick the spot between the two elements that is the closest connection. That way, people may opt to not even have to trim these manually, and you just leave the jump stitch in there. And if you're not worried about trimming it, then you want the closest stitch. And I think the third way of doing this is actually you can go in there and actually drop a stitch in between those elements, and that kind of hides your jump stitch in between. So it'll actually kind of, it'll finish the satin, plot a point in between, go to the next satin. Typically, I don't suggest that when you're doing white thread on darks because it is evident that it's still there.
Yeah. So if we were going to do, let's say, the jump stitch method where we're going to go kind of longest point, I would go from about right here, the third or the fourth stitch up, because if you measure this is roughly 11 millimeters. So I don't want to quite go 11. So I would instead, I'd come from maybe this side actually right here and up to about right there and do that long jump there on each object, and then you could slide your scissors under there and trim out each one. You do need to make sure that when you're doing this that you make sure that you're doing lock stitches if you're going to cut that out, because Wilcom will see this, or Wilcom or any other digitizing will see this as you're doing stitches. And so because you're doing stitches, you don't need a lock stitch. And so if you're actually manually putting in jumps like this, you want to make sure that you're putting lock stitches on this object and on this object to make sure that after you cut that trim, it doesn't come unraveled. Right. Closest join, if we did that, it would either be a jump like straight across right there, or if we came here, we could do it kind of symmetrically around the inside of the circle. So that would be another thing that you could do too, is you could look at it aesthetically and say, you know, do I want a very faint white line running around the inside of this circle?
Right.
Or would I like a very faint line running around the closest joint edge right here? And then the third way that Justin had talked about would be to come from here, drop a stitch in the middle, and come over. And dropping that extra stitch in there is going to help kind of bury that down and hide that into the garment. So
And
those
right.
are...
And typically, I mean, if you're working with like colored threads on colored garments, especially if they're really similar or in the same family, those threads really get lost when you drop that stitch. So it's a good way of keeping that machine running. No trimming, no tails, no, you know, having the machine slow down. It's a good way of keeping that needle down and running. But like I said, if this is white going on a dark garment, I typically don't use that technique. Right. I did post a question. I don't know if Ronell's still there. If he does prefer manually trimming his designs or having the machine trim the designs, because that could, you know, decide what direction we go with this.
Yeah, we could make those adjustments here before we get off.
Right.
One thing I am going to do though, as I come back, and if I would have changed these before I started, I wouldn't have to come back and do it. But I want to make sure that I apply my properties that I have here. So this is going to copy over the underlay. It's going to copy over the pull compensation and the densities. So,
so Ronell says he could do both. So personally, I would stick to trims on this. When you have something symmetrical like this, and it is kind of borderline that distance between where should you trim, should you not, I think it's a cleaner look. Yeah, it's going to add some time on the machine, but this is already a very low stitch count design, so I don't think it's going to make or break production.
Yep. And now we'll just watch it play through, because I like to watch the stitch simulator. So this is actually one thing that I recommend for everybody to do when you're doing a design. And I know all these are going to be the same because they were copied and pasted. But when you do something and you digitize it, it's always a good idea to go and run it through the stitch simulator, because you'll catch large errors this way. So if you don't have any underlay under an object, you'll see it. If your sequence is off, you'll see it. This just kind of gives you...
Yeah, the other day I accidentally grabbed a whole color and resequenced it before the color before it. So I know I digitized all this detail in this truck and it was gone. And I'm like, where is that detail? So I'm hitting undo thinking I accidentally hit delete. And I found the fill of the truck was covering the detail because the sequence I had reversed. So, but yeah, running it through the stitch simulator is definitely a good way to find mistakes, finding things that might be out of order. But yeah, the main points I think that we hit on this is proper underlay, adding some column width to the really thin areas, making sure your density's right, pathing, with pretty much I think that's it. Just kind of hitting on, this is kind of a good example of a real basic design, kind of getting back to basics: density, underlay, pathing, making sure that your start and stop points are in the correct places, where your start points are underneath satins if at all possible, to kind of hide that tail, hide that lock stitch. Same with your lock stitches, make sure they're not on a real thin area where you're going to be smashing a bunch of stitches into a really small area. Just those little key things, and hopefully this file helps him and works out his kinks that he's having.
So before we go, I'm going to add to, if you run this file and you're still having coverage issues and it looks sporadic like we saw on the picture, I would most definitely look at your timing on your machine. Now, for if you're running a design like this and you're doing like a really light color on a dark garment and there's a lot of pile to it, a couple other things that you can do to help with coverage on that is, one is you can use a topper. So water soluble topper is going to help kind of hold the stitches up on top of the garment. It's not necessarily a replacement for underlay, but it's more like a supplement to it to help kind of keep those stitches raised. And then, you know, it's just a little bit more cleanup. You take it off and you spritz it with water and it dissolves. The other thing, and on these smallest satins, I wouldn't necessarily do it, but the other thing is you can add another zigzag underlay or parallel underlay or however it's called in your software under there. So now you have a double zigzag basically going in there. So I wouldn't necessarily up the density anymore, but I would start upping the underlay to get coverage if I needed to. So,
and with the satin widths that we're working with on this, like you said, I don't think it's necessary.
No, and I don't either. So I would move probably to using a topper if I really needed to, because again, it's looking at this is a pretty open weave, and adding a topping might help. But I would definitely run this design on a sample shirt, which I can see you've got sample material, so that's really good. I would run this design, and if you're having, you know, if you want it to stand up a little bit more, you could try running it with a topper under there, water soluble topper, and you can see the difference when you're actually sewing it out, and you can make kind of that call on what you want to do. So I see he just asked me a question here on what density did I use. The density that we're using is a 0.35. So, and that's a little bit higher than I normally would, but you're covering a dark garment with a light thread color. And so I will tend to, and Justin does too, bump up that density a little bit because of the garments that you're covering. So I think that's everything. Fingers crossed.
I think so. Yeah. I'll get the file from Jeff right now and get it over to you. So hopefully this does help the issues that you're having. Post some pictures in the group. Let us know how it works out for you.
Yep. All right. And things coming up. I know virtual applique getaway is coming up here, and I think registration opens for that tomorrow. Impressions Expo is coming up here at the end of the month down in Fort Worth. And I think that's everything that's coming up. I don't think we have anything here coming up, do we?
Nothing planned yet. There might be some stuff coming up.
We'll see. But with that, everybody, I'll go ahead and close it out. We have Justin Armenta from JA Digitizing Studios, and I'm Jeff Fuller from Fuller Embroidery Works, and we're both here representing the embroidery nerd. I'd like to thank you guys for hanging out with us, and we'll catch you next time.
Good night, guys.